Well, this was a project. So we had an issue with the stone on the front of our house. It started to fall off about 6 months after we moved into our home, and we ended up calling the insurance company to see if they would replace it. But unfortunately, because it wasn't deemed an incident, they wouldn't pay for it. So we started getting bids to have it replaced by some contractors, and those bids kept coming in to around $40,000. So instead of doing that, we decided to do it ourselves. Now, I will say we would not have tackled this project on our own had we not come across a product called Versetta Stone. So we found a product called Versetta that is an engineered stone that installs just like siding. It installs with screws, but it's actually engineered stone. And that was important for us because of our HOA. We couldn't just put up something that looked like stone, or we couldn't put up a different type of material. It had to either be real stone or engineered stone. So our options were limited there. So we ended up finding some installation videos on YouTube about how you install this product. And there's some great content out there already, especially from a channel called R&R. So I'll link to that content in the description below so you can check that out if you haven't done that already. But for our instance, a lot of the content and the videos that were available, it was basic installations, things like wainscoting and smaller projects. But for us, it's 400 square feet of stone that goes up to 25 feet in the air. And there's all these complicated angles, including archways that we had to deal with. So in this video, the plan is to share with you all the steps we took to install this very complicated Versetta Stone installation. So that way, if you're looking at doing something similar to what we've done here, hopefully this video will save you some headaches.
So first things first, let's talk about the tools we used in addition to what Versetta recommends. To attach the house wrap and tar paper to the house, we found a hammer tacker was the fastest and easiest method. You could use a standard staple gun. However, it makes it a little bit harder to get the leverage you need, especially when you're working at different heights. Speaking of heights, in order to install the stone at higher elevations, we ended up using combination, or sometimes called multi-position ladders. These were invaluable to our installation process. We also relied heavily on mason scaffolding. Now, you don't have to have scaffolding. You might be able to get away with just a lift, but I highly recommend not tackling this only with ladders if you're going to go up above 12 feet or so. Keep in mind, you'll also need a way to get tools and supplies up and down the scaffolding. So in our case, we just simply used an old tool bag and some rope, and that did the trick for us. To make sure the stone was level, we used a highly visible laser level and marked a line with a silver Sharpie on the tar paper. That way, we eliminated any potential issues with using a chalk line, and also had something to measure against that was highly visible, even after a rainstorm. The main tool we used to cut the stone was this 7-inch Delta tile saw. It did a great job overall, especially cutting accurately and controlling all the dust from the stone. However, if we had to do this job over, we would definitely upgrade from the 7-inch to the 10-inch saw, just to have some more clearance between the saw cutting arm and the saw blade itself. As for some of the more intricate cuts, we also used a jigsaw with a diamond blade and an angle grinder with a diamond wheel. Now we'll get into some more of the specific challenges that we had with Versetta overall, and some really big pointers and things to understand if you've never worked with Versetta before.
When you're installing Versetta Stone, this is something that we keep running into an issue with, which is the panels themselves. While they're supposed to be unique, we thought they were only supposed to be unique with the design pattern and not the actual width of the panels. So you can see here, this is a great example. We're transitioning into a corner and we're butting two pieces up together. And we ran into a problem where the other piece was a little bit too tall. So we swapped it out and we used a different corner, cut a new piece. And then this piece is a little bit too short. Let me show you what I'm talking about. So this is a brand new piece that we just cut. This is a corner, and you can see how far off this is. So we're gonna have to either gap this up quite a bit at the bottom in order to make this work out, or we're gonna have to use a different piece. So let me show you what the problem was in the beginning before we cut this piece. So you can see here, this one's a little bit too tall, right? So there's a little bit more of a gap here. This is the last piece that we're putting in for this level. This is really where we're just coming up above the garage door. We want to make sure everything is nice and flat, so that way when we go up the rest of the way, up the house, that everything's gonna be nice and level. But we've been running into this problem a lot.
If you don't correct this problem as soon as you can, you're going to start running into issues where the rows are either going to be unlevel, or you're going to have panel gaps that are too big to accommodate with shims. When the panel gaps are too big, that means the tongue's not going to fit in the groove and it's not going to provide a secure installation. Now, we found there are 3 different things you can do to fix the height issue. You can simply use some temporary shims to level the panels out before you screw them into the wall. The second is you can grind off the panel once it's installed with a diamond grinding wheel. Now, this is not the preferred method because it's going to generate a lot of dust. It's also a little bit tricky to get the panel completely level. What we ended up doing, and what I would recommend doing on a project of this size, is to sort the panels by height. It's going to make the installation process a lot faster. Another thing to be aware of is that the ends of the panels aren't always square. So this can be a real pain if you aren't aware of this. As you can see here, these are some factory panels that aren't square. This is in contrast to one of the stones I cut on my table saw. Again, this isn't a huge issue, but it is something that you should be aware of, and it can save you some headaches when you're doing the installation. For the complicated cuts, we ended up using a couple of different methods. One, we tried to do as much of the cutting on our table saw as possible because we knew the table saw was square and aligned perfectly. We did have some issues when we would try to cut some of the panels, and we ended up having to cut the panels backwards because the saw wouldn't accommodate the length of the panel for the length of what we needed it to be cut at. We ended up taking a couple of extra pieces of PVC trim in order to accommodate the flange when we had to cut the pieces backwards on the table saw. That just let us have consistent cuts without worrying about whether or not the flange was perfectly even with the top of the stone. For our standard angle cuts, where we had to cut the stone a consistent angle for underneath the roof eave, we ended up making a jig for the saw that was made out of a spare piece of PVC trim and some extra wood scraps. Taking the time to make this jig in the end saved us a lot of time because we were able to make these cuts quickly and consistently. For all of the curved cuts, we ended up having to freehand it, which isn't ideal, but it actually worked out pretty well for us. We installed a 4-inch diamond grinding wheel on a standard angle grinder. Now, the downside is this does generate quite a bit of dust, so you need to be sure to take the appropriate precautions, including wearing a mask that will protect you from inhaling all this extra dust. If you have to make curved cuts, I'm afraid this is the only technique you can use to make everything turn out right. For some of the more detailed cuts, we used a jigsaw and a diamond jigsaw blade to cut through the stone. That process worked okay when we needed to use it, but because the blade was so short, we had to be careful that it didn't bind up. We also had a couple of areas where we needed to thin the stone out because we wanted the stone to fit behind the gutters. Same process applied for that as well. We used an angle grinder to take out the extra thickness of the stone. To make the marks for the complex cuts, we used measurements scribed onto a spare piece of Versetta Stone. We used templates made out of cardboard, and we also used pieces of wood depending on what we needed to do at the time. Out of everything, scribing on a spare stone worked the best for us, and we recreated the marks on the actual stone piece with a pencil or a Sharpie. To attach partial panels, the ones that either had no tongue or no nailing flange, these were in areas like above the garage or underneath windows, we used wire mesh along with Loctite PL Max Premium to attach the panels to the house. This is the same process we use with our light boxes for the front porch lights. Also, in some cases, we used a Tapcon drill bit to drill a hole into the panel so we could install a screw as needed. We used this mainly underneath the eaves and put the screws in the mortar joint lines in order to hide the screw head the best that we could. Since our installation had a lot of exposed edges, we thought we would be able to get by with just using corners on the edges. However, we didn't like the looks of this because there's a significant gap between the back side of the stone and the wall where it's installed. We ended up going with some custom metal flashing that we used to install to hide the gap between the stone and the house. In order to blend this in even further, we used a paint from Rust-Oleum that was able to match the mission color stone veneer very well. Above the garage door, we used some custom metal flashing as well, and we also used that same spray paint to blend the color into the stone as best as we could. Between the stone and the wood trim for the garage door, we used some self-adhesive waterproof flashing tape to form a seal and prevent any water from getting behind the Tyvek house wrap where it meets up against the wood trim.
So going into this project, we had two big concerns that we weren't sure how to solve. One was getting the stones cut around an arch. So we have this archway behind us with the entrance, and we also have an arch window up top. So that was the first problem. And the second problem was, how are we going to trim it out? So Versetta makes a product that you can use to hide the edge of the stone in addition to the edge-based stones that they manufacture. But the J-molding that they make for that purpose is plastic, and we really didn't want a plastic look around a finished entrance. In addition to, with that plastic J-molding, it probably wasn't going to look quite right with it being bent around an archway, so we had to come up with some other solution.
We ended up using PVC trim board for those areas because it had a nice look and it was no maintenance. The most cost-effective option for us was to use a 12-inch wide PVC board to cut the archway out. Now, we still weren't able to get the entire archway covered. However, we were able to assemble multiple pieces together to form the entire arch. We used a cordless jigsaw to cut the 12-inch PVC board, and we tried a couple different blades. The first one we tried was one specifically for PVC, and the other one was for laminate countertops. The one for PVC worked okay, but it didn't leave a very clean line. The laminate blade worked a lot better, but it did pull a lot of the material up to the top, which blocked our line, so we had to stop frequently to clear that away. Once we were finished cutting, we used an orbital hand sander to clean everything up. To attach the PVC sections together, we used a combination of a Kreg jig, some staples, and some PVC glue to help make sure everything stayed in place over time. First, we used the Kreg jig to make a pocket screw inside of the PVC to hold the sections together, and then that gave us a nice dry fit to make sure everything lined up. After which, we ended up taking the PVC apart. We took some OD PVC primer and glue to glue the sections together. We put the pocket hole screw back in place, and then we used some staples as a good measure just to make sure everything held in place while it was being installed. And before we installed the PVC trim, we used the same paint that we used for the metal flashing. Thankfully, this paint not only bonds to metal, but it also bonds to plastic. To install the PVC trim to the house, we used some specialty PVC screws that included some PVC plugs that would hide the screw heads once they were installed. Again, to cover up these plugs, we simply used the same paint that we had used before. Also, in our case, the wall wasn't perfectly even where the archway was because it was butting up against some stucco, so we ended up taking some spare PVC scraps that were cut into different widths so we can stick that behind where the screws were going to be attached to the PVC. Now, this may have been overkill, but to prevent water from getting behind the PVC arch, we also installed some of that same adhesive waterproof flashing. We took this extra precaution because, again, this is butting up against stucco, and the stucco was held on by some metal lath, and we didn't want that to rust out. We used the same process for not only the entrance, but also the arched window. And for the square window, we simply had to cut the pieces to size, and then we assembled it in place. At our entrance, we had a couple of porch lights that we needed to deal with. To install those, we used the Versetta Stone light box that includes an extension for the electrical box. In our case, we couldn't connect the extension to the existing box that we had installed in the wall directly, so we ended up using a 4-inch offset crossbar and some extra machine screws in order to tie everything together. Also, to make the wiring easier, we used some standard Wago connectors. The lights we chose had a backplate that was a little bit taller than the light box, but it still worked out okay in our case. Just be sure to keep that in mind when you choose lighting. To reattach our address plaque, we found a relatively flat area and drilled holes through the stone with a masonry bit. After the holes were made, we attached the plaque with standard exterior wood screws. And to make sure the screws blended in, we painted them with some black enamel spray paint.
All right, that's it for this video. Hopefully you found it helpful. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button. And also be sure to check out this other video here. I'm sure you'll like it too. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.